a lot of this stuff gets looked at in like such a fucking silo that that people go, oh, like AI ethics and this policy, and like there's this huge gap between what we say and what we want to do. And then, over here, Canadian forests are burning, or like the Amazon is basically reached a tipping point, or I don't know, we're headed for like 3 to 4 degrees of warming. All the glaciers are melting. We're going to have billions of climate refugees. Our food system's probably going to collapse, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know. It's impossible. Like on like my spectrum is like, fuck over here. And then on this side, it's like, how the fuck are we not doing something different? Like we need to truly transcend the paradigm if we want any way through and out of this madness. And that's just the same lens that I apply to this issue. So yeah,
it's hilarious in some way that like we keep talking about this stuff, like that, this article that prompted this discussion around, the fact that so many organizations in terms of ethical AI use, development and use, just they're not following through on like any commitments. Some of them are kind of got their heads in the sand. And on the other side, we've got this huge set of challenges in terms of the livability of our planet that is like seriously looming. I mean, we've just come out of, like, we're in the midst of a heat wave here in, at the start of spring with mid 30 degree temperatures here in Sydney. And that is not normal. We're coming into potentially the worst bushfire season that we've ever faced. And we've got these perpetual discussions on developing policies and, creating all these bureaucratic mechanisms to, address these challenges, like this one, specifically in tech. But it is hilarious that we're kind of in this position. It seems crazy that we're just here almost ignoring like this looming thing. It's like, look up, it's coming towards us. Like, what are we going to fucking do? How do we adapt?
It's 10 kilometers in diameter, and it's moving at 40,000 kilometers an hour. And yeah,
so, and we from like, a reasonably systems literate perspective can see the complexity of this, the seriousness with which we've got these things looming down on us. The shadow of the asteroid is here. How do we move it, right?
To make that sort of like more concrete, like we've already been hit. We're already like scattering everywhere, right? It's just that the 10K diameter asteroid hasn't yet hit. Like, so that I think that's important to recognize, because, on one end of the spectrum, like you've I don't know, like you've got all this like people that are living amidst like the ecological and biospheric crisis right now. Islands are going under, people are having to buy new land elsewhere. Like we have billions of folks that are going to have to move in the coming years. And then on the slightly less extreme end of the spectrum, you've got kids, suffering from heat stroke in September, like the start of spring, so there's this whole, I don't know, it's hard to not be deeply frustrated and fall into like this state of existential dread and nihilism and just like, I don't give a fuckery. But that's not helpful, right? If all models are wrong and some are useful, we need a useful model here. And that useful model has to be based, even if it's probabilistically unlikely, needs to be based on some type of existential hopefulness that is grounded in our capacity for like thoughtful and reasoned and beautifully ambitious ingenuity, that balances the best of what we have in the technosphere with some type of deep love, care, and respect for the genius of, big N nature, and applying that type of like paradigmatic lens to what we're dealing with in socio-technical development, and specifically AI systems. And this is, for us, this is a balancing of the elements. So first of all, it's that reorientation away from the obsession with fire towards like a grounding in the alchemy of the elements, and doing so in a way that is like caring and respectful of one another and everything else around us. Like recognizing, this language might not work for lots of folks, but like the sacredness of life. And if we're not engaged together in some type of existentially hopeful, radical collective action that sees the sacredness of life as kind of like fundamental and irreducible, if you want to think about it that way, then maybe it's sayonara, like quite literally. And I know that's hard, right? No wonder folks are burying their head in the sand, but that's not useful. We've got to lean into this thing if we have any hope of coming out of it.
Yeah, that level of courageousness that like we need is absent in so many ways. I mean, it's present in small pockets, and I think from my perspective, there's so many people doing so much amazing work at the moment. It doesn't get elevated in the conversation. It doesn't get elevated in like these articles. This article that from ZNet that prompted us to have this conversation. Because in aggregate, we're kind of seeing so many of these problems. Shifting, and can absolutely empathize when you realize the enormity of the predicament that we're facing. It's fucking scary. Like,
yep.
And if you reading articles and coming across things that are looking at the destruction of our biosphere and like all the implications of climate change and things like that playing out over the next several years. I mean, that's scary. Like, and people feel powerless. Like, what can I actually do? What can the everyday person actually do apart from like the recommendations on shifting their consumer behavior towards buying more sustainable products, or writing an article to their inept and incompetent MP that doesn't really understand how to actually address any of these issues.
Yeah.
Is entwined and entangled in the cronyism, corruption of our democratic institutions. So it's hard. It's scary. We feel it. Everyone's kind of feeling it, but again, it's like, what's the responsibility of, people that do have power, that do have decision-making power, be that in technology, like to actually think about, well, how does more ethically aligned AI design and development support us in transitioning to, a planet that we can flourish, that is like at first and foremost, that is livable.
Yeah.
But also where every human is taken care of, and by virtue of every human being taken care of, because we rely upon all these biological natural systems to actually flourish and be taken care of, that we're actually living in this symbiotic relationship to nature. Like, how do we develop these systems to actually support us in that transition? Because we can't, like, with our current patterns, we can't do it.
Yeah.
So how do these technologies support us in doing it? Because this is mass scale coordination towards very clear direction around our shared humanity, with a sense of existential hope. Because we have to believe that we can do this, that we can actually get through this complex intertwining of crises that we're facing.
Yeah, and I think this, you and Alia encouraged me to read Imaginable, which is a more popular sort of book than I would normally find myself reading. But like, I think there's something very interesting to be said there. Like, we have to imagine the unimaginable on kind of like both ends of the spectrum in terms of like basically biospheric system collapse, such that certainly no human life can be sustained. We have to fully imagine that possibility, some might argue probability, frankly, at this point in time, so that we can figure out how to kind of like work through it. But a couple of things that come to mind here really quickly. One of them is like the boundaries of care that are very humanistic at the moment, and also exclusively humanistic, because care is like certain care, affordance, etc., is given to some over other, based on all these different ideologies, dogmas, deeply entrenched sort of narratives and whatnot. So we need to obviously extend that to encompass all of humanity. And then that needs to go way broader. Like, again, it has to be the sacredness of life itself. But I think here about the way that we presented to the IEEE folks recently on using like the 6E cognitive model, the way that Viveki extended that, how the process of doing ethics can be embodied, embedded, enacted, extended, emotional, and exaptive. Like, it has to be something that we live, that we breathe, that we feel, that is part of our being. And I think if we bring those 6 E's to life in the context of doing ethics within an organizational or institutional setting or any other setting, and we massively extend the boundaries of care, and we combine that with a radical hopefulness, then there is a possibility to kind of work through this. Now, I know we're talking around the edges. There's a concretization here that we can provide in terms of, well, how does elemental ethics play out in an organizational context and stuff like that. But like, I think for now, this probably gets at the gist of some of what we need to cover. And, for anyone that has paid attention to us for however long this has gone on for, if you want to get into the details of how can the process of doing ethics like extend its boundary of care, how can it be embodied, embedded, enacted, extended in terms of like, into our tools, our systems, into one another, etc. How can it be emotional? Like, one of the things, you have like the Markula Center for Applied Ethics does some fantastic work, but when they describe what ethics is, one of the first things they say very clearly is ethics is not emotion. Now, I actually think when you look at cognitive science today, it tells us that the relationship between emotion and what we think of as thought, it's pretty tight. And even saying that thought and emotion are different I think that's a really hard claim to make nowadays. And perhaps that is there's a lot of hangover effect based on the way that we've thought about like different dualisms, particularly from Descartes and whatnot. But like, the human being is a biopsychosocial organism that exists in relation to and develops in relation to their environment, right? So you can't remove the human, the biopsychosocial organism, from its environment. Like, it is its environment. And you can think of that spiritually, you can think of that at the level of particulate matter and shit like that. But like, yeah, so I don't know. That's more than 2 cents, but maybe it's 50 cents, and we need to get Curtis Jackson to do a song. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this gets at the change in the paradigm shift comes from like new visions, new stories, new memes.
Yep.
That shift the thought, emotion, action, provocation,
Yep.
the way that people experience life, perceive life themselves, their role in the greater story. And that's kind of at the heart of it. And I think it's happening. It's happening in so many different ways. Like, if I think my children in school, if they're doing activities where they're reimagining public spaces, where they're reimagining like cities, communities, like the places in which they live, their relationship to nature, and they're encouraged to think about like how do we live in more symbiotic relationships? How do we have this symbiomimetic design of our curricula? Because they're the ones that actually have to create this. We're responsible for helping set those foundations so that they're capable, competent, caring, to be able to do that. It's, you know, and it's like, how are our curriculums actually changing to do it, but also how are we taking responsibility to ensure that what we're doing now is a mirror reflection of the highest ideals that we want our you know, the next generation to live to.
Yeah, like it's, you know, we absolutely need an aspirational value system. It's like Futera did this really interesting thing called the awesome Anthropocene or something like that, which was like an because the SDGs are problematic for so many different reasons that we don't have time to get into right now. The fact that these things are goals when they should just be like basic sort of fundamental conditions of, but yeah, so pushing that to the side. So Futera did this really interesting thing, or Futera, called the like awesome Anthropocene goals, where they really tried to extend. And I think we need something like that, that contributes to this paradigm shift that we're talking about. So there's like this like radically ambitious and beautiful kind of like highest order value system that we're like, yes, that, because so often we just don't believe that better is possible. You know, I'm powerless, I'm apathetic, there's nothing I can do. That's not true, right? Because if all of us don't believe that, if all of us refuse to believe that, if all of us say better is possible, and you know, we're like, unless everything does collapse and all that can come out of that is some basic subsistence living, who knows, like your guess is as good as mine, then we're not going to go back to our literal roots, right? So we have to do this in such a way that technology, we don't overly rely on technology, particularly unproven technologies, like all of the back stuff that, you know, that is overemphasized, that is unproven, that probably has lots of negative externalities, et cetera, but that where possible, we recognize that technology is of us. Like it is nature, right? It's not some abstract thing. It's based on all these resources. It's based on our creative ingenuity, like our collective endeavors. And we need to find a way for humanity, the technologies that we design, regardless of like how they're kind of like architected, and the rest of nature, we need to see that all as one to some extent, right? And find a way for all of that to dynamically interplay towards those awesome Anthropocene goals, or whatever, you know, whatever that highest sort of value system is that we're talking about. You know, like we've got to believe that better is possible, and then just do it. Just live it, just breathe it every day. You know, every feckin' day.
Seems easy.
It's so easy. It's so easy.
Seems easy. It comes with its many challenges when we're trying to live and breathe this way of being and learning and growing and relating to each other and the world around us. When you pause and reflect, you know, and use that water element in elemental ethics, seeing yourself as part of the greater whole. Like how many practices does a CEO that's leading a major corporation around the world engage in those practices and embody those practices in the work that they do? Probably maybe from a personal level, and maybe even from a you know, a kind of messiah complex level that probably takes place amongst many of these senior leaders, but that needs to be brought into the practices of leadership. Like how much, when was the last time you saw a political leader with real moral courage stand up and lay down like the reality of how fucked up shit is, right? Yeah, well, you know, maybe we'll see some. I'm hoping that we do.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And they don't get shot, assassinated, or go missing, or kind of be taken by some submarine or something.
It's interesting, like just really quickly on this. So, we've been talking a lot lately about how we ritualize the process of being in the bush, and that we have this like deep resonance with the Australian ecology. And but there's also like, so often when we're doing, like, let's say we try and do moral imagination in a stale boardroom, good luck. For so many different reasons, we take folks out of that context and we're in the bush and there's nothing, right? Like nothing that we're used to. And it's just like the sounds and the movements and the vibrations of nature. And it's the ants crawling along. It's like the butterflies, it's the pollinators, it's the like all these different bird calls, and it's the birds jousting with and fighting with one another. And then it's the flow of the, the river or the creek or whatever it may be. It's often the dryness of, the soil and the ground, but like it's all teeming with life, no matter how hard we've tried to almost like destroy that. It's teeming with life. And I think when we operate in these expansive spaces, it changes our capacity to imagine something different. Like if you're like, I don't know, if you're even in, you're engaged in the process of composting, you're seeing this active living, breathing sort of enzymatic metabolic process going on that you're sort of orchestrating to some extent, but it just happened like, for a very, 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 very long time. And you're seeing all this incredible life. And then how can you step back? Now, I know you can, but it's harder. It's then harder to step back into the staleness of a corporate boardroom and make decisions when you are externalizing, when you know that what you are doing based on your constrained value system of maximizing shareholder value, like it's so much harder to be in that context and embody that context and then come back into the narrow value system and do that. Now, so like, what is something maybe surprising for some folks that's come out of it, like go walk about, go into, whatever you're, if you, and we're speaking from positions of privilege here, like we can choose, I'm going to go do that. So like, I get that. Science, philosophy, etc., all after survival. But I think science and philosophy and mythology and all of these different things need to be part of our survival toolkit going forward, as a species. But, get out, get amongst it, get your hands dirty, just like sit with life, like outside of an urban environment, if you are afforded that opportunity, and try and take whatever the insights are that you glean from that process back into your position of influence.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard
Right.
hard for or decision makers in a boardroom or in their corporate space, in that corporate environment where they've got their existing rituals and practices and behaviors, ways of thinking and doing, like it's deeply interconnected with their environment. So you have taking people, like being able to go, yeah, like there's a workshop that's actually in nature. It's nature bathing, it's forest bathing, like you're starting that walk and then you sit down and like through that immersion, taking people out of that environment, because to change behavior, the best way to do it is to change the environment in which that behavior takes place. They're able to take that inspiration from the sounds, the feelings, the senses of nature, the birds, the sounds of the wind going through the trees, and then engage in the process about, well, what do we do now? We want to protect this. We want to still have this for future generations. What is my responsibility now in the work that I do as a senior leader in a billion-dollar corporation, to actually ensure that we can learn from nature.
Yep. And look, and one of the harsh realities here, folks, is even if, let's say, the only lens through which you morally imagined was like this, like sort of deeply utilitarian perspective, there are so many times if you were applying like a systems literate lens to your consequence scanning, there are so many times that you will not be able to justify net benefit. Even the environmental cost of like the resources, etc. Like when you actually look at the entirety of a supply chain and how that plays out over, the generation of like an algorithm's development, how it gets deployed, etc., etc. there are going to be so many times where you cannot justify net benefit. And that's just looking at it through a very sort of utilitarian, consequentialist type lens, providing that there's some systems literacy to that. And the answer is going to be, hey, we don't. And that's where the moral courage has to come into it, because it's one thing to engage in moral imagination. It's one thing to embody and ritualize and like deeply practice as a way of being. The sort of like alchemy, the modern alchemy, if you will, of elemental ethics. But like, you then have to do it, right? And that requires like real courage. It's one thing to simulate, but you then have to do. Close that ethical intent to action gap. It's not always easy.
Yeah, it's a failing forward. Like living towards like these highest ideals requires an acknowledgement that realizing them in their fullest is almost an impossibility, but that does not mean you shouldn't try.
Absolutely.
So that fear of never reaching it, and overcoming that inertia as a result of that fear is something that needs to be fully embraced.
Journey, not the destination, y'all. Journey, not the destination.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Till next time. Good conversation. Hopefully this was interesting and provoked some reflection and action from those that managed to listen to it.
Go forth with love, people. Go forth with love. Hug a tree, hug a person.
Yeah, a hug a day at least.